in my point of view, you can't separate the the uh, the concept, the political concept in the political context, not just the geographical or historical, but in
Mhm.
the political context, you can't separate um, the term or the assertion or the validity of indigenous or indigeneity
Mhm.
from colonization, because but prior to that, it wasn't really a concept that had to be argued, disputed, or asserted.
Mhm. You're
Um,
right.
when you find people in power, you don't really find the arguments or assertions or debates or cultural movements around indigenous. Like you rarely hear someone talk about I'm indigenous
I know where you
European
go.
or I'm an
Mhm.
indigenous British, or even if you go to somewhere like Nigeria where they say I am an indigenous Nigeria, you
Right.
mostly hear people making claims about being indigenous in parts of Latin America where over 97% of the native population
Mhm.
was exterminated,
Mhm.
in the USA, where the native population was still to this day is under an active campaign of genocide
Mhm.
and living on living in concentration camps. So um, the concept of indigenousness and determining who is indigenous and trying to set aside rights and set aside lands and speak to the needs of the indigenous population, that is a byproduct of colonial domination.
Oh, it's
And
no
so
question.
and so when African people start to in the United States, there's a whole Black indigenous movement
Mhm.
where they're talking
Mhm.
about foundational Black Americans or the
Yeah.
Americans that have been here since chattel slavery, having more of a
Right.
legitimate claim to the land. And many, there's been conflicts of African people, because my great grandfather, Sonics Bowie, was born
Mm.
and raised on a Lakota reservation in the
Interesting.
Oklahomas. And
Mhm.
they're the Black Indians. I never go around talking about I'm part Indian, I'm half Indian. I make no claims to the indigenous, because African people got Indian blood the same way we got white blood through, because Native Americans owned Black people, enslaved Black people, and raped Black people. So I don't claim, the rapist heritage. So um, I don't think in the modern era, if we're having discussions around indigenous struggles, indigenous rights, or indigenous identities, that you can separate that from colonization. Because if not for colonization and European imperialism and other, neo-imperialist Chinese and things of that nature, and you wouldn't really have so much conflict around who's indigenous and what should be afforded to the indigenous populations versus the invaders, the colonizers, and then the forced immigrants who were brought there against their will, and now they have to make a way there. So all those issues are interrelated. And I think that if an enslaved or colonized people should stand in solidarity. If you find yourself on a colonized land, you are a forced immigrant or a migrant there, you should hold solidarity with the indigenous people in their struggle, as opposed to holding solidarity with the invaders and the colonizers. And that's where I stand. Although I know the history, I'm in solidarity with the Native Americans of the United States in
Mhm.
their efforts to secure justice and even to
Mhm.
expel their colonizers. While I don't feel that I need to make claims of indigenous standing or indigenous clout in order to have that legitimate stance in this land. You know.
Oh, no question. I completely agree with that stance. You know what I mean? If you're talking about, the idea of the promotion of indigenous as a title, it's definitely a relic, if you want to call it a relic, because we're still living in it, of coming in contact with in particular Europeans. But I can hear some of the naysayers in my head, because I follow all the people who supposedly oppose me all the time. They'll say, "Oh, people invade each other all the time." This is definitely what Europeans have done is definitely different. But I completely hear what you're saying about the conversation about indigenous is linked to the colonial experience. No question. And it's funny that you should bring up the question of standing in solidarity with those who are indigenous, because I see it as simply a justice claim. If I come to a place and I see the people have so many similarities to me in terms of exactly what the actual origins of the problems of the life are, if you true to your own mission, if you're true to your own justice claim, you have to, out of moral, you have a moral obligation to stand in solidarity with them. I completely agree with you, which is what makes it so reprehensible what I see a lot of folk who come here actually do, including some of the Black folk that I know who are also in Australia. All right. That is also what you can talk about, because, I think there's a conversation to be had here about what happened recently to the two sisters who were, where were they? I believe they were in Indonesia. They went to Indonesia and then they got deported because of some things that had happened. And I've seen that sort of thing. I've seen that sort of thing happen in a few places around here. I don't know if we have time to talk about it, but there were definitely some things that happened that are similar to the kind of deaf ear that can happen to us when we don't pay attention to the local problems of the folk who are also fighting against the white folk who may be dominating in their region, or sometimes the Asian folk who are dominating them in their region. That's something that comes up right next door in Papua New Guinea or in West Papua, vis-a-vis the Indonesian government. So,
all right. So David asks, do your studies and analysis follow along the lines of Dr. Runoko